Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Well, I am Christy Sullivan. I am the secretary of the American Society for Cellular and Computational Toxicology, and I'm here with our esteemed speakers today, as well as Anne-Marie Vingard from ESTIV. This is our October webinar presented by our two societies, and I encourage you to visit our websites to find out more about our organizations, and then even consider joining to support programs like this webinar series. The webinar is recorded, and the recording will be posted on the ASCCT website a couple days from now. And in the webinar platform, you can ask questions of the presenters using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen in the toolbar there. Please use the Q&A for your questions. Please do not use the chat. There will be a Q&A period after all three presentations are finished. You can add your questions at any time. If you have a question for a specific speaker, please indicate that, or if it...
Hello, everyone. As Christy mentioned, I'm part of the ESTIV board, the European Society for In Vitro Toxicology, and we are having our annual meeting next year in Prague. It'll be in the beginning of June, and there'll be a lot of interesting presentations on in vitro toxicology. So if you're interested, please go and have a look at the website. There's an abstract deadline. It's actually tomorrow, but if you have an abstract and would like to join, please send it to us. Thank you. Christy, I just presented this slide.
Awesome. Thank you. I have no idea what happened. My internet must have cut out or something. So I'm so sorry about that, everybody. Let me get us back to where we are. Thank you, Ree, for stepping in. I wanted to mention one thing, which is that we just had a meeting ourselves, ASCCT did, and it was last week, and it went really well. We had lots of folks in the Silver Spring area come and participate, and if you are interested in what happened at that meeting, we'll have sort of a maybe a review on the website, as well as the slides will be available to members. And we are getting started with planning the next meeting, which will be again in October of 2024 in Research Triangle Park. So if you want to join the organizing committee, just let us know. Also, really briefly, we have two webinars. We actually have three webinars coming up. We're scheduled all up until the end of the year. The one in December is not quite, it's not on the registration page yet, but we'll get that up soon on our website right now, ascctalks.org. You can see that and register for two upcoming webinars on November 14th. We have Bita Escher from Helmholtz Center for Environmental Research. And we also have Joe Niffler from Helmholtz Center for Environmental Research on November 27th. So feel free to register for both of those. And finally, let me get to today. We have three presenters today. We're going to be talking about the OECD QSAR assessment framework, some details of this new document, and some examples of how it can be applied. We have three speakers. Unfortunately, Dr. Patience Browne is not available right at the moment. She got double booked, and so we have a recording of her quick introduction. And then we'll have presentations from Olga Tcheremenskaia from Istituto Superiore di Sanità and Andrea Gissi from the European Chemicals Agency. And let me introduce all of our speakers, and then we'll get started. So Dr. Patience Browne is Principal Administrator for the Hazard Assessment Program at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. She earned her PhD at the University of California, Davis, and was formerly a senior scientist at the US EPA, along with other roles. Olga Tcheremenskaia is a senior researcher at the Italian National Institute of Health. Her expertise includes alternative animal-free methods of risk assessment, such as QSAR models, integrated approaches to testing and assessment, and adverse outcome pathways, as well as data management and database development. Olga holds a PhD in chemistry of biologically active substances and a master's degree in biochemistry. And then Dr. Andrea Gissi has been working in the Computational Assessment and Alternative Methods Unit of the European Chemicals Agency since 2013. His main responsibilities include the assessment of QSAR studies in REACH registration dossiers, the project management of the OECD QSAR toolbox, and the coordination of ECHA's activities on QSARs. He holds a PhD in pharmaceutical sciences and a master's degree in medicinal chemistry. So I'm going to share the first presentation, which will be a recording of Patience's presentation.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where in the world you join from today. My name is Patience Browne, and I'm with the OECD Secretariat. I'm the Principal Administrator for the Hazard Assessment Program here at OECD. And it is my pleasure to be providing a high-level overview of the QSAR assessment framework, a document that was recently published by OECD. I'd like to thank very much the organizers for inviting me here today and allowing us to promote the QAF. And also thank you to my colleagues, Olga Tcheremenskaia from ISS and Andrea Gissi from ECHA, who will be providing presentations that have much more detail and content on the QAF following this introduction. So first, as a point of orientation, I'd like to talk a little bit about the OECD work in the QSAR space. So the QSAR toolbox was developed in the early 2000s as a tool with the intention that this could be used to support placing substances into chemical categories to predict apical outcomes of regulatory interest. In addition to forming categories, the toolbox was developed with the idea that it can be used to use data from tested category members or analogs to aid in filling gaps for untested category members, or in other words, to be used in a read-across approach. And while the current version of the QSAR toolbox that's available now certainly does that, it also does a lot more than that. It's an increasingly sophisticated analytical tool that now includes experimental data from over 60 databases that cover more than 100,000 chemicals and 3 million data points. And these data can be mined for read-across predictions. It also includes a variety of profilers, including structural profilers that support formation of structurally similar substances within a category, and mechanistic profilers that help to understand mode of action and can be used for supporting the mechanistically sound basis of category formation as well. In addition, there are metabolism simulators that predict metabolites from parent compounds and can also be used to support category formation and read across. So we see at OECD the QSAR toolbox as playing a key role in supporting alternatives to animal testing. It is one of many tools available from OECD, but increasingly we're pointing towards computational approaches and NAM-based alternatives to animal testing. The QSAR toolbox can be used to inform testing strategies by forming categories, as I've already mentioned, and identifying data gaps, as well as supporting intelligent testing strategies that can be designed to reduce not only the cost of chemical assessment, but also greatly reduce the numbers of animals required. The toolbox can be used to predict properties of chemicals. So in many cases, predictions can actually replace information requirements that may be based on animal tests, or be used to support authorities in their regulatory processes, for example, prioritizing chemicals for additional testing or for substance evaluation. The toolbox can also be an important tool for industry, for example, to support sustainable development in green chemistry. And such computational approaches can be used to predict toxicity of substances even before they're produced. So to assess the safety before there's a substantial financial investment. Of course, as many of you know, there are a handful of global drivers to use new approach methods in chemical risk assessment, including computational approaches such as the QSAR toolbox. And one that gets highlighted is the, of course, reduction in animal use. And while this is a key driver, it's certainly not the only driver. And in fact, in many cases, new approach methods may increase the throughput of chemical assessments. They use the best available science. They reduce time to decision making. And in some cases, they may actually be more relevant to target species. In many cases, we think of this as humans, but not only humans, more relevant than the animal-based traditional test methods. And the overall combination of this really means that we can increase the total number of chemicals that are assessed. And for some estimates are as high as 70% of chemicals for which there are not adequate data to come to risk assessment. The new approach methods can really help to inform and accelerate this process. So to give a little background on the QSAR assessment framework and the identified need for this, while the project was added to the OECD Hazard Assessment Work Program in Q1 of 2021, this was actually in response to a recognized need for such document that was really mentioned several years before this in our QSAR Toolbox Management Group. The project proposal was initially submitted by the Istituto Superiore di Sanità, or ISS Italy, and then the European Chemicals Agency, or ECHA, later joined as a co-lead. But the work, in addition to the incredible investment of both of the leads, was supported by a QSAR Assessment Framework Expert Group. This is a group of experts that were nominated by delegates to the Working Party on Hazard Assessment, and the group provided general input on the project. They provided feedback on the proposed path forward, and of course, written comments on a variety of drafts. The group met primarily through a series of teleconferences that took part throughout 2021, 2022, and the beginning of 2023. And there were drafting subgroups as well that contributed to the two main sections of the document and provided not only novel writing, but also review of drafts. We held a face-to-face meeting in Paris at OECD of the QSAR expert group, the QAF expert group in Q4 2022 to help finalize the draft document. And this was immediately before the final draft was circulated to the Working Party on Hazard Assessment for written comments at the beginning of 2023. All of the feedback and comments were taken into account, and the final draft document was endorsed by the Working Party in June of 2023 and then declassified at the end of August, beginning of September of 2023. So very recently, in fact. We have available through OECD channels, not only the sort of traditional document that you're used to seeing from OECD, but we have a very nice PDF glossy version of the QAF as well. And here is a QR code for those that are interested in finding it through that app. So what's included in the QAF? First of all, the objective of developing such a document was to develop a systematic, transparent, and harmonized framework for regulatory assessment of QSARs and their results. So while we have several documents at OECD that date from the early 2000s on principles for evaluating QSAR models, the scope was really extended in this document to cover not only models, but also QSAR predictions and results based on multiple predictions. In terms of the applicability and relevance of the document, it's really intended to be relevant irrespective of the technique used to build the QSAR model, the predicted endpoint, and the intended regulatory purpose. The audience was primarily geared towards regulatory authorities, but it's also a very valuable reference for other stakeholders that intend to use QSARs for regulatory purposes. So, what's included in the QSAR assessment framework? As I mentioned, this work is really based on some foundational documents, guidance document 49, which is the principles for validation of QSARs, and guidance document 64, which is guidance for the validation of QSAR models. So one is principles, one is guidance on how to evaluate the principles. And in fact, both of these OECD guidance documents are based on guidance document 34, which are the validation principles for internationally harmonized test methods. All of this work was undertaken in the early 2000s, and one of the first tasks for the QUAF expert group was to revisit the principles and guidance for QSAR models to determine if they were still relevant. In fact, the group decided that they were. So while there are sections on principles for assessing models, these are really based on those other documents. But for the first time, the QUAF extends the principles for assessing QSAR model predictions and QSAR results from multiple predictions. So this is really an extension of those principles beyond the previous documents, as well as a great deal more guidance on how to assess those. So for each of these, the models, the predictions, and the multiple predictions, the group developed assessment elements and a checklist of criteria. So there's guidance on how to determine if the criteria are met for each of these assessment elements and examples illustrating how to evaluate the criteria. This is really intended to greatly facilitate regulators' scientifically robustness nature of QSARs that are submitted and under their review. Of course, you'll hear a great deal more from my colleagues who will be presenting after me. But if you're interested in finding out more, I will point you to the OECD QSAR Toolbox webpage, which you see right here. I'll also highlight that we have an upcoming OECD webinar that's really very similar in content to this one, but in case you missed anything, it will be on the 9th of November, and you can register through the OECD website. After that webinar, there will be links to the presentations that are provided so you can revisit and share with colleagues at any time. We also will have a variety of links to examples of how to apply the QUAF in certain circumstances, and those will be added soon. But there's also a variety of other background documents available on that website. So I will point you to either Google that or use the QR codes shown on the slide here. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to hearing the discussions following presentations from my colleagues after myself. Thank you.
Well, we will thank Dr. Browne in absentia for her presentation. And if you did have any questions on that presentation, feel free to put them in the Q&A, and we can submit them to patients. Well, with that, we will go on to the next presentation. Dr. Tcheremenskaia, I see your slides. So the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Christy. Thank you for the introduction. And hello, everyone, and welcome to my presentation. First of all, let me thank you all for joining the webinar. And I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me. I'm really very delighted to be here today. So my presentation will take about 30 minutes, and the subject of my talk will be the first part. Will cover the first part of the QSAR assessment framework, which is dedicated to the assessment of QSAR model. Some specific examples will be given for assessment criteria. So let me begin by explaining the main structure of the QSAR assessment framework guidance published by OECD just a couple of months ago. On the left side here, you see the main structure of the QSAR assessment framework and the first page of the glossy version, while on the right side, you see the table of context, and I will show you the part of the guidance that will be illustrated in my presentation. It's related to assessment of QSAR model and QSAR model checklist. So this slide gives a short overview of the existing OECD QSAR model validation principles that have been used as a starting point in our project. The set of 5 principles was established and published by OECD in 2004. And then a guidance document for transparent application, those principles was developed and published by OECD 2007. The OECD QSAR model principles have been widely used by the scientific and the regulatory communities for almost 20 years. And this principle include the defined endpoint, unambiguous algorithm, defined domain of applicability, appropriate measures of goodness of fit, robustness, and predictivity, and mechanistic interpretation if possible. So at the beginning of the CAF project, the OECD principle and related guidance from 2007 were re-examined in order to identify possible needs for modification or update. Rather than development of an extensive textual guidance, the expert group recommended a more practical and workable document that should be flexible enough and regulatory framework independent. This process led to the development of a new checklist and the related short guidance for the models. And they are both based on the well-established OECD principles that were considered by the group still relevant for the purpose of QAF. But the innovative aspect of this project is that as a result of the work of the CAF expert group over the past 2 years, each of the principles has been divided in the assessment element. So the guidance provides some more detail for each assessment element, and the checklist provides more practical advice and examples, and each assessment element can be evaluated and reported in the checklist. So next, let me give you some background information on the definition of some terms within QAF relevant for the model assessment. So model checklist is a separate document aiming to facilitate the assessment of QSAR models according to QAF principles. It includes a list of assessment elements. Assessment element is a critical aspect to be considered when assessing QSAR model, prediction or overall result. So then the definition of QSAR model is it's a model that predicts a property of a substance using as input information of the structure. So here we prefer to use term properties to use term of endpoint because of the different understanding of the meaning of the term endpoint depending on the audience. So the Excel file containing the checklist can be downloaded from the Annex C of the QAF guidance, and the assessment elements can be evaluated and reported in 3 different checklists. You see here model checklist, prediction checklist, and result checklist. In my presentation, we will be talking about model checklist, and the CAF provides some kind of a roadmap starting with the criteria assessment element related to the assessment of QSAR models. And the assessors should assign a value to each assessment element that could be fulfilled, not applicable, not accessed, not documented. And the comment field is also available here. And the analysis of each element supports the overall decision of on whether the model is suitable or not for intended regulatory purpose. So the aim of the model checklist is to provide a harmonized and user-friendly evaluation of a model. It should facilitate the practical application of the principle for QSAR model evaluation. And you see here the Excel table is the next to the model checklist, model criteria, and QMRF mapping. QMRF is QSAR model reporting format that has been established many years ago and used by many QSAR models. So you see here different columns. The first one is the ID number of assessment element, name of assessment element, objective, what should be checked and how, practical advice, example, and mapping to QMRF format, reporting format. So the first, and now in the next slide, I would like to expand on each assessment element, emphasizing the aspect related to practical advice and example. So the first OECD principle is defined endpoint. The intent of this principle is to ensure transparency in the endpoint predicted by a given model. Endpoint should be determined by different experimental protocol and under different experimental conditions. Here is the only time we use the term endpoint, not term property, because it's used in the title of the historically established OECD QSAR model validation principle. This principle has been subdivided in 3 assessment elements that will be addressed in the next slides. So the first assessment element here is clear scientific and regulatory purpose. The objective of this principle is that the predicted endpoint should be clearly defined in relation to a scientific and or regulatory purpose. What is necessary to check here and how? The predicted endpoint should be clearly defined and consistent with the data used to build the model. For a clear scientific purpose, the predicted endpoint should refer to any effect that could be measured and therefore modeled. And for a clear regulatory purpose, the predicted endpoint should refer to a specific regulatory requirements or test guideline. So here is an example. If we have a predicted endpoint, which is fish short-term toxicity 96 hours, as LC50 according to the OECD testing guideline 203. In this case, the assessment element can be considered as fulfilled. Another example is predicted endpoint classification for skin sensitization according to GAKS criteria. And again, the purpose is clear, so assessment element is fulfilled. A practical advice would be to collect all information as possible, including all elements that have been considered, for instance, unit of measurement, time scale observations, such as growth, mortality, etc. So going to the next assessment element is assessment element 1.2, transparency of the underlying experimental data. It's about the data quality, and the objective here, the documentation should be sufficient to independently assess the quality of the experimental data that have been used to build the model. So what is necessary to check here and how? All substances should have the clear identification, for instance, names, structures, mile code, and inventory number, and so on. And also there should be reference, ideally should be a reference to the original studies, and the description of all relevant experimental conditions should be provided. Provided the original value in case of data processing should be also provided here, and also information on data processing unit or scale of conversion. In the case of data aggregation, for instance, if multiple data for the same substance were aggregated for modeling, also the information should be documented. And the information on the experimental data selection and correction procedure is also important here. So the example number 1 is when the model documentation includes the list of substance from the training set, also the experimental value for the predicting property, and detail or reference for each data point. In this case, everything is perfect. This assessment element is fulfilled. Let's talk about the second example. For instance, if as predicted property, we have bacterial mutagenicity according to OECD testing guideline 471, but the information on the strains and on metabolic activation is missing. In this case, this assessment element cannot be considered as fulfilled, as it's not fulfilled in this case. So practical advice here would be it's in real world, it's not always we will have full detail on each data point, but at least in general description of the experimental data selection and the correction procedures should be always expected by regulators. So the next assessment element here is quality of the underlying experimental data. Here it's necessary to ensure that the model is built on data of sufficient quality to obtain acceptable prediction. and what to check and how. Here is important to access the experimental data curation procedure and to access the quality of the data point individually if possible. So the example here, the predicted endpoint is fish long-term toxicity. But if the duration of the exposure was not considered when selected the data to build the model, it can be suspected that in some cases the data for fish short-term toxicity were used for modeling. So in this case, this assessment element is not fulfilled, and the model cannot be considered as valid for predicting of fish long-term toxicity. Practical advice here. It's ideally data point should be evaluated individually, but very often, especially for large training set, it's not possible. And in this case, assessors can verify how the relevant experimental condition that could affect the results of experimental studies, for example, species, temperature, exposure, period, protocol, have been considered when selecting data to build the model. For model with large training set, it's also possible to recheck some data points, and in some cases, lower data quality can be compensated by a large number of data points fitting the same trend. So the second OECD principle is an ambiguous algorithm. The intent of this principle is to ensure transparency in the description of the model algorithm and so the reproducibility of its prediction. This principle has been split into 3 assessment elements that will be illustrated in more details in the next slides. So assessment element 2.1, description of the algorithm and or software. The objective here is to ensure that it's clear how the prediction is obtained and that it can be reproduced by others. So here is important to check if sufficient descriptors of description of all descriptors and approach to select them is provided, and also to check the availability of a transparent description of the algorithm and or software, and to explaining how the prediction were produced. For fragment alert-based models, the list of all fragments, so active, non-active, all substructures should be provided. And also for equation-based model, a description of the equation and all data and approach used for the selection of descriptors should be documented here. So an example, if we have a very good user manuals, publication related to a model, help files, in this case, describing in detail the algorithm, in this case, this assessment element can be considered as fulfilled. Practical advice here, we have many commercial models when it's not always possible to access to detailed description of the algorithm. So at least all available relevant information should be assessed, and the model when is implemented in a computer program, and the evaluator can just provide to obtain a prediction and to test the reproducibility of the result, even if the full description of the algorithm is not disclosed. And in this case, assessors may decide, it's up to them if this is acceptable for certain regulatory uses. So assessment element 2.2 is input and other options. Here it's important to check availability of instruction to prepare the input and availability of information on the editable optional settings of the computer program where model is implemented. An example here, for instance, if we are predicting a property for salt and detailed instruction on the preparation of the input, include instruction how to pre-process salts, in this case, assessment element can be considered as fulfilled. And practical advice, there could be different cases. For instance, for simple computer program where there is no any editable settings, it's less important, but it's very important to check the information on the input for the complex computer program where there are editable settings. So the next assessment element is model accessibility. Here, availability of the same model or computer program and version described in the documentation should be checked. And as an example, for instance, if you have a property predicted by in vitro mutagenicity Ames test alert model, it's fragment-based model implemented in TOX3 software version 3.1.0, for instance, and the software is available on the following web address. So in this case, assessment element can be considered as fulfilled. And practical advice, when a different model version is available to the assessor, it could be considered to test also another version and to compare the results. So the third OECD principle is the defined domain of applicability. The guidance from 2007 describes the applicability domain as the response and the chemical structure space in which the model makes prediction with a given reliability. Elaborating on the applicability domain definition given above, the applicability domain should consider the parametric structure, mechanistic, metabolic, and response space of the model. And the QAF guidance does not prescribe a specific way to define the applicability domain because there are also multiple methodology for this. But instead, the QAF focuses on practical aspects of the assessment. This principle has just one assessment element that will be explained in the next slide. So assessment element 3.1, it's clear definition of the applicability domain and limitation of the model. What to check and how. Here, it's important to check that applicability domain definition has sufficient details to decide whether a substance is within applicability domain or not. As an example here, if we have let's say the prediction report obtained using a model, which includes the information on the applicability domain of the model in relation to the input substance, explaining in detail how the assessment is done. Here, the assessment element can be considered as fulfilled. And practical advice, many modern models as automatically can assess automatically if a substance falls within the applicability domain or not. And in this stage, we are talking about a global definition of the domain, because also some consideration about local applicability domain can be also very important, but it will be considered in the second presentation. So the next OECD principle is appropriate measures of goodness of fit, robustness, and predictivity. This principle provides information of the goodness of fit and robustness of the model is determined by internal validation, and the predictivity of a model is determined by external validation. It's important to mention here that the model performance should be measured within the applicability domain defined by model developers. This principle is divided into assessment elements, which will be addressed from point of view of practical advice and examples in more details in the next two slides. But as to scientific aspects concerning this principle, the OECD guidance from 2007 can be consulted. So this slide summarizes the assessment element 4.1 goodness of fit robustness and assessment element 4.2 external predictivity. The objective of these assessment elements is to ensure that measures of internal predictivity as well as external predictivity are provided and considered adequate by an evaluator. What to check and how? It's important to check here the available information on the statistical methods used for internal external validation of the model. For model predicting continuous endpoint, availability of at least basic statistics such as correlation coefficient value or standard error. For models predicting categorical endpoint, at least basic statistics such as accuracy, sensitivity, and specificity should be available. If the regulatory context set some reference value, an evaluator can compare the performance of the model to the reference value, but here we are not providing any threshold and any minimal acceptance criteria. It really depends to a certain regulatory framework. As also, it's important to indicate whether cross-validation or resampling was performed, and if yes, by which method. So now let's talk about examples. For instance, if for a model predicting categorical endpoints, the information on accuracy, sensitivity, and specificity on the training set and on external set is provided and considered good enough by evaluator for intended regulatory purpose, in this case, assessment element is fulfilled. And practical advice, we are talking here again about the general performance of the model. For accessing individual result, local performance can be assessed within the prediction checklist, and this will be illustrated in the second presentation. If a model documentation does not report any external predictivity evaluation, the regulatory authorities responsible for the assessment should decide if this is acceptable for the application or not. If the external validation has been performed using data selected according to different criteria than the training set, in this case also the data quality should be assessed. So the last fifth OECD principle is mechanistic interpretation that should be associated with QSAR model if possible. So if relevant assessors may require that the model documentation includes consideration on the mechanistic interpretation, which should be consistent with the knowledge related to the predicted property. For instance, here adverse outcome pathways information or toxicokinetics consideration can be a part of the mechanistic interpretation. This principle has just one assessment element that will be explained in the next two slides. So assessment element 5.1 is plausibility of the mechanistic interpretation. What is important to check here? First of all, scientific plausibility of the proposed mechanistic interpretation. For example, the provided references to scientific literature. If selection and interpretation of the descriptors is explained and consistent with a known mechanism of action. And also it is important to understand at what stage of modeling the mechanistic basis of the model was identified, and the interpretation of molecular events that can be activated by molecules containing a certain structure, substructure could be important here because these substructures can act as stressors in different pathways activation. So even if this mechanistic interpretation is very important, it's still considering as optional, also as had been suggested by the guidance from 2007 by OECD. So here is an example. We have a skin sensitization property predicted by a fragment-based model. And if the model documentation includes an explanation how some structural alerts are able to bind the protein, it's well known that the protein binding is the first step or molecular initiating event in the skin sensitization adverse outcome pathway. So this kind of information is provided. This assessment element could be considered as fulfilled. And practical advice here, it's even if this assessment element is not mandatory, the availability of mechanistic interpretation facilitates greatly the regulatory acceptance, and the literature reference can support the proposed mechanistic basis. And also important indication whether the mechanistic basis of the model was determined a priori or posteriori of modeling, but in both cases the mechanistic interpretation is very useful. So then on this slide I would like to show you what is the place of the model checklist in the global QSAR assessment framework workflow. So the CAF provides a roadmap starting with the assessment of QSAR models and then extending to the requirements specific for the evaluation of prediction and results. And you see here highlighted the part of the CAF workflow covered by me today in my presentation, while the next part will be illustrated in the next presentation. Also, it's important to mention that in the case of the results based on multiple prediction, the compilation of the model checklist is required for each model. So here is just a quick recap of the main points about the QSAR model checklist. When accessing the prediction obtained by using the same QSAR model for the same regulatory purpose, there is no need to repeat the model assessment each time. However, if the regulatory purpose is different, the assessment should be repeated, and it's very important to always keep this in mind that the assessment of a model is regulatory purpose specific. When assessing a large data set, assessment of individual prediction may not be always possible. So in such cases, assessors may need to rely exclusively on the use of the model checklist. For model accessor, the model checklist can greatly facilitate the identification of all important information available in the model documentation in QMRF format. And from another point of view, the checklist could be also useful to model developers because indicating the best practices in model documentation preparation. So in my last slide, I would like to conclude and just to sum up the main application of the model checklist. The compilation of the model checklist is the first step in the assessment of predictions. If a model has been considered as not acceptable for a specific regulatory purpose, then the assessment can stop there without considering a prediction checklist. Our expectation is that the application of the model checklist can help to improve transparency of the model evaluation by regulators. The model checklist can be used as a standalone tool for screening of large data sets. In addition, the model checklist can be reused for prediction generated by the same model for the same regulatory purpose. And furthermore, compilation of the model checklist helps to verify that all necessary information is present in the model documentation. And the mapping between the model checklist and the QMRF reporting format can serve as a sort of feedback to model developers for further improvement of their models and related documentation. So this brings me to the end of my presentation, and then I would like to thank my colleagues Cecilia, Chiara from ISS for being the co-coordinators of this project, the OECD Secretariat for their so great constant support, and the whole CAF expert group, and the ECHA co-lead Andrea Gissi, who will be the next presenter today. Thank you so much again. If you have any question, I will be happy to answer them because there will be time for Q&A session at the end of Andrea's presentations. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tcheremenskaia. That was a great presentation. We're going to continue the information with Dr. Gissi. And so go ahead and share your slides. I also wanted to mention that we do have Dr. Browne here on the line. So as I mentioned, you can add your questions in and we'll have all three speakers answering questions in the Q&A. Okay, everything looks good.
Yes, now I'm also unmuted, so you should also be able to hear me.
Yes.
Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining this this webinar, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me. Today is the first time that we present the QSAR assessment framework since its publication. So I'm very much looking forward to the feedback and the Q&A session to see how from outside the group you have received the document so far and what kind of questions you have. In my presentation today, I'm going to cover the assessment of predictions and results based on multiple predictions. So is the second part of the QAF, which, by the way, as Olga explained, is a very practical document. It's not very long. If you don't consider the annexes, we are looking at 27 pages. So I think it's like nice practical document. Let's see, for the assessment of individual predictions, this was one of the main reasons why we prepared the QSAR assessment framework. The use of QSARs is allowed in many chemical regulations, and principles to assess the validity of QSAR models have been around for a long time. However, the use of a valid model does not guarantee the validity of each of its individual results. And there was the need, therefore, to establish principles to assess the validity of individual results in a systematic way, in a harmonized way, and the QSAR assessment framework was the place to do this. So to establish an assessment framework for prediction and results, first of all, we had to establish principles that needed to be followed and fulfilled. And we came up with 4 principles. A correct input. The substance must be within the applicability domain of the model. The predictions must be reliable, and the outcome has to be fit for purpose. For results based on multiple predictions, we recommend to check each prediction individually first, and then to perform one additional step dedicated to the final result. In the guidance document, you will find some text, 1 or more paragraphs, on each of the assessment elements, which together are used to evaluate each principle. But then further details are given then in the checklist, as was Olga was showing for models and as I will show for predictions. And so the guidance also explains the conditions when something is considered acceptable or not. This is the checklist, and it's an Excel file, and basically you have the possibility to select the outcome from a pick list, assign the uncertainty, and you have to deal with the weight of the assessment elements. And I'm going to explain all this now. So first of all, we have the weight of an assessment element. This is how important is the assessment element in the context of use of the prediction. It depends on the purpose and can have 3 values: low, medium, and high. So first of all, when you use the checklist, you will see some default values for the weight of each assessment element. And like, if you are not sure, I think it's good to stick to the default values. One of the reasons why we had to introduce the weight is because one of the requirements when we worked on the QSAR assessment framework was to prepare a framework that has to be flexible enough to use the QAF for different regulatory frameworks for different purposes. And when defining the assessment elements, sometimes there was not even like consensus. Can we really look into the performance of the model for similar substances, or how the substance relates with the physicochemical structure and response spaces of the training set of the model, and so on. So we introduced the weight so that if for the certain regulatory framework and purposes, the regulators responsible for it, they decide that those assessment elements are not important or do not need to be assessed, then they can choose a lower weight for them. Then for each assessment element, we have the outcome: fulfilled, not applicable, assessed, not documented. These are the same values that we have for models. But then one additional element for each assessment element is the uncertainty. Uncertainty intended as how confident is the assessor with the outcome, like basically that an assessment element is fulfilled. And also here we have three values: low, medium, and high, where by default the high uncertainty is also assigned to assessment elements that are not fulfilled or not documented. We introduced the uncertainty because we knew that in a real cases application, there could be many cases where whether an assessment element is fully fulfilled or not might be a little bit borderline, in a kind of gray zone, and also not so much black and white. So in those cases, we recommend the assessor to indicate the assessment element as fulfilled, but then the assessor has the possibility to indicate higher uncertainty if the case is not so clear-cut. So once the checklist is compiled for each assessment element and also the uncertainty, then the assessor can conclude on the individual prediction, and also in this case there is the overall uncertainty and then the outcome of the assessment. The uncertainty of the prediction can also be low, medium, or high, and it is based on the highest uncertainty of high weight assessment elements. Basically, to determine the final uncertainty, you only look at the high weight assessment elements and you take the highest uncertainty from them. Concerning the outcome of the assessment, also in this case can be acceptable, not acceptable, insufficient documentation. But it's very important to understand that the assessment is specific for the intended purpose, meaning that the same prediction might be acceptable for a purpose and not acceptable for another purpose. And the document suggests to accept predictions with low or medium uncertainty and not those with high uncertainty. Here we are looking at a screenshot of the checklist file. Olga was showing, I think, even more nicely in her slides. There are multiple spreadsheets, and each checklist is coupled with this criteria spreadsheet, where there is practical advice, examples, even for the prediction checklist. Also for the uncertainty, you have the explanation of each uncertainty level for each of the assessment elements and examples of low, medium, and high uncertainty. So this part of the QAF is a little bit hidden, if you want, as compared to the main guidance or to the main checklist. But I think some of the most important and practical information on the QAF is given in those spreadsheets. So remember to check them if you use the checklist in practice in your work. Now we can go through details and examples for the prediction checklist. What I did for each principle, I have listed all the assessment elements, but then we will see examples of only one assessment element per principle, just in the interest of time. So input is considered as correct when there is a clear and complete description of the input and model settings. So assessors need to have all information, including the structure, parameters, model settings, in order to be able to reproduce the prediction and verify that the number or the result provided is the same that is obtained by the assessor. The input must be representative of the substance under analysis. So the structures modeled have to represent the substance subject to regulatory assessment. And this may sound trivial in the beginning. I want to predict ethanol. I put a smiles of ethanol, so the prediction is representative of the substance under analysis. Yes, but for example, in the case of rich, less than 50 or more than about 50% of the substances are either multi-constituents or substances with unknown variable composition, biological origin, and so on. So to fully represent the substance subject to regulatory assessment, you may need a number of structures, or you may even have to define what are representative structures when the structure is not so well defined. So it's not obvious this point here when the substance is complex. And finally, if there are input parameters used to generate a prediction, even the reliability of those parameters needs to be checked. Let's say that you have a prediction based on the log KOW, and the log KOW is you have to manually input it. We want to see information on how reliable is the value that you are using as input. When we go into more details on one of the assessment elements, here I put the first one, clear and complete description of the input and model settings, what to check and how. It is clear whether the structure is input using smiles or other identifiers. If other parameters are also used as input, they are described. If relevant, conformational information is also given. In case of editable options, check if default settings are applied, and if not, if a justification is provided. And if we have the example of a model that requires smiles and optionally log KOW as input to generate a prediction, then the assessment element will be fulfilled with low uncertainty if both smiles and log KOW are provided, medium uncertainty if the smiles are provided and the log KOW is not provided. This, I mean, is an example that we see, for example, quite many times in ECHA, and then we have to guess ourselves the log KOW or check if the default log KOW is used. So in the end, we often find a solution even if the log KOW is not provided. But like cases with high uncertainty that are difficult to deal with is, for example, if the CAS number is given instead of the smiles used as input, and then the CAS smiles association may be ambiguous and we don't even know what is the input of a model to generate a prediction. This is unacceptable. Then we have the principle of the substance being within the applicability domain of a model. And I think here I have to spend a few words, I could have done it earlier, to explain the difference between applicability domain and reliability, which we have like made very explicit in the QSAR assessment framework. As was already mentioned, there is not an univocal correct way to define applicability domain, and we didn't want to prescribe a way to determine applicability domain within the QAF. So what did we decide to do? We decided that when assessing a prediction, first we check the applicability domain according to the definition as given by the model developers, whatever this definition is. Then, in addition to the definition used by the model developers, we also check some aspects of the prediction which we believe are important for a prediction to be reliable. Many of these aspects might be already included in the applicability domain defined by model developers, and in that case, we don't have to repeat the assessment. But if some of those aspects have not been considered during the development of the model, we still have the chance to check them with the reliability when assessing the reliability of the prediction. So it's a little bit of artificial distinction if you want, because both applicability domain and reliability assess the reliability of the prediction. But from a practical point of view, I think it makes our job much easier and transparent, having this split between applicability domain as defined by model developers and reliability. And when we look at the applicability domain, we also look at other limitations of the model that need to be considered. And also here, they can be both consider aspects of the applicability domain, but it is often the case that you have the applicability domain described almost in mathematical terms, statistics basis, and so on. And then in another part of the documentation, you have a small note. By the way, my model is only applicable to organic substances, or salts cannot be predicted, and so on. And we want to make sure that the assessor check both the applicability domain as formally defined, but also all these other limitations that can be a little bit hidden in between lines sometimes. Here we have more details on the assessment element 2.1, that the substance is within the applicability domain. So if the applicability domain is automatically calculated by the model, then it's easy. But if it's not calculated automatically, then we need to manually check the criteria given in a paper, in an info file, and the report. And here we have examples of low, medium, and high uncertainty for a model that automatically assesses the applicability domain. And we have low uncertainty if the model tells that the substance is 100% within domain. We have medium uncertainty if the model tells that the substance is 100% within domain, but it is unclear how this 100% is calculated. While in case of low uncertainty, a clear explanation will be given on why it's 100% in domain. And finally, here we have a high uncertainty when the model indicates that the substance is mostly within applicability domain, but some fragments of the substance are, for example, unknown to the model, and therefore the substance cannot be considered to be fully within applicability domain. These are the three uncertainty levels if the assessment element is fulfilled. If the substance is out of domain, then the assessment element is not fulfilled, and automatically a high uncertainty is assigned. In terms of reliability, this is the most complex principle to assess. We have the reproducibility of the prediction, the overall performance of the model, the fit within the physical, chemical, structural, and response spaces of the training set of the model, the performance of the model for similar substances, mechanistic and or metabolic considerations, and consistency of information. So here I have details on the performance of the model for similar substances. So here we are looking at local performances of the model. We may be facing situations where the model has very good general performances, but then perform poorly in the space of the target substance. This is worse than having a model that has overall average performance, but the model may perform very well in the chemical space that we are looking at. And here we have the example of a case where the predicted substance is aliphatic saturated C8 secondary amine, and then we would have low uncertainty where there are data for other similar substances that encompass the C8, so we will be in interpolation space. We could have medium uncertainty where we have some data for the substances, but we will still be extrapolating to our C8 secondary amine. And then we have a high uncertainty if we have data for similar substances, but not all the substances are predicted well, and then we have to really try to understand if the model might be wrong also for our target substance. Finally, we must check if the outcome is fit for the regulatory purpose. And here we have three assessment elements: the compliance with additional requirements in case the regulation requires some extra validity criteria for predictions. I'm thinking, for example, at cases where two models might be required, a statistical model and a rule-based model. Then if there is this additional requirement, then we must check that it is fulfilled. Then we have the correspondence between the predicted property and the property required by the regulation, because sometimes and this is also linked, by the way, to the well-defined endpoint, but I mean, the properties required by regulation usually are very, very specific, and if the model is not as specific in its prediction, then it could be that the outcome is not fit for purpose. And finally, using the QSAR prediction, we must be able to decide within the specific framework about the substance and to take a regulatory decision about it. For example, if we are looking at bioaccumulation of a substance and we have a threshold of for a BCF of 2000 liters per kilograms, well, we must have a prediction expressed in the same unit or in a convertible unit so that we can decide from the prediction if it's below or above 2000 and decide if the substance is bioaccumulative or not. If we can't make this decision because the result is expressed in a different way, then the outcome may not be fit for the regulatory purpose. Here I have some details on the correspondence between predicted property and property required by regulation, but I think in the interest of time, I'm going to skip this one. And so we have some time to speak about the assessment of results based on multiple predictions. We might be looking at multiple predictions when there is just one structure, but then a prediction from different models are used, or we have the same model, but different structures, for example, for substances with a complex composition, or we can have a combination of the above, which, by the way, is quite common, at least under ECHA. So in this case, we have a dedicated checklist, the result checklist, that should be compiled for each prediction, and the assessment elements are the same than for individual predictions in this case. But then there is one extra assessment element, that is a correct determination of the final result from individual predictions. And after this, we need to determine the uncertainty of the final result by weighting the uncertainty of individual predictions. So if we have consistent independent predictions, then the overall uncertainty might even be lower than the individual uncertainty. But if they are contradictory, then the uncertainty might get higher for the final result. And then we need to decide on the acceptability of the result. And also in this case, the QAF document suggests to accept results with low or medium uncertainty. Here we have the example of the last assessment element, correct determination of the final result from individual prediction. So for example, we need to check that the statistical method used to determine the final result is explained. We need to check if the regulation recommends specific rules, like a worst case approach for the aggregation of the result. And we have the example of a regulation that requires a conservative approach when considering multiple reliable predictions. And then if the assessment element is fulfilled, we will assign low uncertainty if the predictions are reliable and consistently predict low toxicity. And then the final result is low toxicity, justified as consensus result. We may be looking at medium uncertainty if both predictions are reliable, but they produce slightly different results. And one of the two values is preferred without justification, but because the values were quite similar, maybe we don't bother by assigning even higher uncertainty. On the other hand, if we get two predictions with significantly different results and just the average is used without justification, knowing that the regulation would have required a conservative approach, then we would assign high uncertainty. A justification in this case may make a difference, but in the example, we have no justification. This is just to look like a visual look at what I just explained. You have the individual predictions with the uncertainty and outcome. They are put together in a QSAR result, and then you can check how the final result is determined. And then you have a conclusion on the final result that has its own uncertainty and outcome. Visual abstract from the QAF. This has already been shown by Olga, but basically the information on the QSAR model is given in the QMRF, which is prepared by the model developer, and then the assessor checks the model checklist. While the QSAR prediction and result and conclusion, this is prepared by the QSAR user. So here there is a difference. There is developer for the model and the QSAR user for the QPRF. And then the assessor checks the prediction checklist. And similarly for a result for multiple predictions, there is multiple QMRFs, multiple QPRFs, and then in the end, one result checklist and the model checklist. Also worth noting that with the QAF, we also took the opportunity to update the QPRF, the QSAR prediction reporting format, which has now 8 main sections that mirror the QAF. General information, substance, model and software, prediction, input, applicability domain and limitations, reliability assessment, and purpose of use. while the QMRF is only a minor update, because in the end we didn't update the OECD principles for the validity of models, and because we know that the model developers put so much effort to prepare the QMRFs that we didn't want to change the QMRF with no real need, because this would have triggered a lot of work. When I say minor update, it means one field called abstract with the number 0, so not even the numbering is changed. And we have like added some details in the description of the fields, which otherwise remain the same. To conclude, there is still some work to do. Endpoint specific case studies that can be proposed under the OECD IATA case study project. So the QAF had to be flexible, applicable irrespective of the endpoint, and so on. So we couldn't go up to a certain level after a certain level of details. There were also too many endpoints then to cover. So we said to different regulators, if you are interested in a specific endpoint, in a specific regulatory use, let's deal with it as an IATA case study. We have also identified the need to work on reporting, and we are in the middle of a project to extend the OECD harmonized templates to report user information. And we have also realized that it will be good to develop a report for results from multiple QSAR predictions. And then in other work that in theory needs to be done, we have a potential even a bigger update of the QMRF if we want to provide fields to give even more detailed information. And then there was quite some debate on how to measure external predictivity of QSAR models. So there was the recommendation that maybe there could be some clarifying guidance on how to measure the external predictivity of a model. To finish with some acknowledgements, in addition to Olga and patients who are present, were speakers today, there were also Cecilia Bossa and Chiara Battistelli, which I think they are in the audience today. Then we had also Tomoko from the OECD Secretariat, but also every member of the QAF group was like very important, because the document improved every iteration. We were circulating the document 300 comments, 400 comments to try to make it like more precise, more easy to work with, and so on. So I think this saying that if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together, really applies to the work we did. Here you have the official list of the QAF group members that participated into the group. In reality, there were even more, because people might have been joining together with their group and so on. So once again, a big thank you to all the people that helped us with this work. And with this, I think I'm done with my presentation, and I'm very much looking forward to the Q&A part.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gissi. We have quite a few questions coming into the Q&A module. I will say, just a warning, my internet continues to be a bit temperamental today, so hopefully I will stay with you all through the Q&A, but if I disappear, my co-hosts will be able to jump in. So, well, let's get started. We have a question to start off that is, maybe we can get some of the pretty straightforward questions out of the way. I have a couple of questions here. And just to remind you, please put your questions in the Q&A module. So there's a question about the QPRF, wondering if the fillable templates are available, and will these be updated to reflect the reporting feature?
So yes, we don't have I wasn't sure whether Patience was going to join us for the Q&A or not. This would have been a good question for her.
She was here, and I think she might have just lost connectivity.
Okay. But okay, in case she doesn't come back soon enough, for sure that the QMRF and QPRF, like they are presented in the QAF as PDFs. We agreed to put links to Word files on the website. I'm not sure whether they are already available, but if not, there is a plan to make them available. We acknowledge that right now, if you want to find the QMRF or QPRF, you don't know to which website to go, which version to use, and so on. So we thought this is a good opportunity to give a consolidated version, a link to the OECD website, and so people will have no doubts. So if it's not available, which might be the case, it will soon.
Okay, and maybe a related question. Does the QMRF file replace the model checklist, or are both necessary?
And that's for Olga.
Yes. So I would like to emphasize that the checklist and QMRF reporting format are two different documents, and they have two different purposes. While QMRF is a reporting format addressed to the model developers, and in the same time, the model checklist is a checklist that should facilitate the job of model evaluators. So they have many things in common. That's why we provided in the last column of the document supporting the model checklist the mapping to the QMRF. But we have discussed it quite extensively during the teleconferences within the QAF expert group. And then that has been decided that for the moment we are not going to update QMRF because it has been used by different softwares in the last 20-30 years maybe, and it's also implemented in different software. So QMRF for the moment has not been updated. And it's there are no two different documents, but in the future there might be possible that there will be some efforts and to some initiatives also within OECD or to update the QMRF format. For the moment, we just have a mapping between them, and I think it would be useful both for model evaluators to quickly understand what is in QMRF and what is missing, and also for model developers because they can consult the checklist and see what are the best practices in the model documentation.
Okay, thank you, Olga. So this question is going to be probably for both of you. I'm curious, and also what patients would have to say. It's about transparency of the training database. How do you envision that collaborative modeling approaches with confidential company data would have to be reported? And they give a couple of examples, which you can probably see, for example, I think FDA allows sort of anonymized confidential data. Obviously, you can't speak for FDA, but maybe you could talk, each of you, a little bit about how this issue came up in the discussions and what you would recommend.
Yeah, it's I can start and then Andrea can continue. So I think that yes, it's a problem when we are talking about the transparency of underlying data, because for commercial models the full training set and the full set of descriptors and all other information on the data used to build the model are always not available, often not available. So in these cases, as I try to explain also in my slide, all available information about the data selection, if any information available, should be provided. Also the points of discussion on the local predictivity, but that Andrea can they may explain better than me. It's also could be important. So starting from all available information, each regulator can make a decision whether the information provided is sufficient or not sufficient for a certain regulatory purpose. But again, the assessment is always strictly regulatory purpose specific, so there could be there could not be any unique answer for all cases, I think.
Yes, and I mean, under each people use commercial models, and they should be able to use them, although for obvious commercial reasons, training sets may not be available and so on. We have found like different compromises. One of them is to ask, especially when the training set is not available, to provide in the QPRF at least information on the closest analogs, because in the end, having the training set is a lot related to understanding like the performance of the model, the quality of the data, and so on. And if we can assess it for at least 3, 4, 5 analogs of the target, that's much better than having nothing. Other possibilities are always to also, for the commercial companies, to contact the regulatory authorities and maybe share under confidentiality agreement some of the information that cannot be made public, but that can be shared to facilitate the assessment. That's another option. And again, here each authority may decide whatever is the preference. I know that there are authorities that, if they know that the performance of a model is good enough, then they they don't request the training set because they know they will not get it. So it's really, yes, compromise of pragmatism, if you want.
Patience, did you want to add anything?
Just to say that, thank you very much to my colleagues for providing great answers. I don't have much to add other than this is a discussion that comes up at OECD quite frequently. We don't want to restrict the use of very good, robust models because of lack of transparency. So we really sort of default to whatever the regulators decide is their level of acceptance for such restrictions. And obviously there's proprietary information in many of the in silico tools and the QSARs that are available. So I think the QAF does a really great job at helping regulators evaluate that in a transparent and systematic way. And then their willingness to accept different levels of transparency is really to the discretion of the specific authorities.
Great, thanks.
While we have a patience on the line, if we can go back to the question, the one I think patient, I'm not sure you heard it. There was a question on whether the QMRF and QPRF are available as a separate document that can be filled in like Word files or similar. Have we done this already, or is it coming?
They are linked to the OECD QSAR homepage, however, not necessarily the recent updates. So that's something we can do. And just for information, we plan on making the QSAR information much more user-friendly, but OECD is doing some redesigns on their web platforms. So that will be forthcoming, hopefully soon. And we know it's a little bit difficult to find information, but of course, we're happy to provide links in the chat and associated with this talk for those that are interested in being able to find such information.
Yeah, what we can do actually is just put some links underneath the recording of the webinar once it's posted, and that way people can get where they need to go. So there's actually a related question. There's a couple of questions on sort of artificial intelligence and deep learning modeling. And so I wonder if you might say a few words on, the question is, how do you envision that models based on deep learning should be reported, where the model is easily available, but the underlying structural alert database is not? So sort of similar, but are there any specific discussions around AI type models?
I think there are no specific discussions. When we developed the QAF and the checklist, we thought that thanks to the flexibility of the QAF, these models, one way or the other, should be able to be assessed. At least if I think about ECHA job, in the end, what matters for us is being able to evaluate the individual prediction. So even if the model behind the software might be very complex, if the prediction reporting format is clear, allows us to assess local performances, allow us to assess applicability domain, even if certain aspects are not as simple to get as it will be with a linear regression with one descriptor, that's okay. Maybe some assessment elements of the checklist might be not documented, not assessed, because we either don't have the documents or we don't know how to do it. But as long as we can evaluate the individual prediction, at least for rich purposes, that might be good enough.
Yes, I think that the purpose of the whole CAF is to be not prescriptive at all, but to be flexible. So it's allowed to each evaluator or regulatory agency to decide if the provided information is sufficient or not. But it's a great question. I think we are not, the CAF focuses on the endpoint and the model technique independent approach. But yes, it's really interesting. And I would like to add maybe that within the big European partnership park, there is a dedicated task that consider how to facilitate the regulatory acceptance of artificial intelligence based QSAR model. So maybe in a few years we will have more documentations and more guidance on this point. So thank you for your question.
Yeah, that is great to hear, Olga. Thank you. Okay. There was, well, I wanted to actually address one of the questions that was answered by another attendee. So thanks for jumping in, but it's about the FDA, and it was a question about whether the QSAR toolbox was accepted by the FDA. So obviously we can't say one way or the other, we can't speak for FDA. And I would recommend contacting the agency and chatting with them or talking with them, because I think these regulatory acceptance processes are always changing, and it may be that there are specific ways to use a variety of models for FDA needs.
Christy, can I make two comments on this, and not speaking on behalf of FDA, but on behalf of Toolbox, of QSAR Toolbox.
Yeah.
So first, the QSAR Toolbox, despite the name, it mainly does read across with manual input and expert judgment. So you don't really get QSAR predictions from the QSAR Toolbox unless you are running external QSARs with the Toolbox, which you could do also just by using the external tool on its own. You don't have to go through Toolbox. So this might be one of the reasons why maybe FDA does not accept it. Some people misunderstand the results of QSAR Toolbox profilers as QSAR predictions, but they are not. Profilers are means to group substances together on mechanistic basis. So that's not a surprise for me that someone is saying, okay, FDA does not, because like QSAR Toolbox does not really do QSAR prediction in the traditional sense. And the other generic comment I wanted to make is because as ECHA, we receive often the question, do you accept this model? And the answer is that we do not accept or reject models. We accept or reject predictions. So what matters is the specificity of the prediction. You are submitting much more than the model it comes from, because within the context of the prediction, we will assess also the model basically for that specific purpose, for that specific substance, and not just because in general a model may work well or not.
Thank you. That's a really important additional piece of advice and information. I also wanted to call your attention to the answered tab on the Q&A because there are some questions that are coming in that folks are answering in a written format. So just to make sure you can see those. Let me double check here. So there was a question early on in the webinar, so I think it was during Olga's presentation, that asks, are there any QSAR models or endpoints for which some of these assessment elements can be considered as fulfilled, especially the more commonly used models and simple endpoints?
I believe here it's important to underline that there is no prediction and no evaluation of a model that lasts forever, because it's really regulatory framework specific, and even if the same model is used for different regulatory purpose, the compilation and evaluation of the checklist should be always repeated. So we are not providing here. There was some discussion on this point, but we are not providing any threshold, any minimum acceptance criteria in the CAF. So let's say that we cannot provide any example. I think that any model, even a simple one, that can be always be acceptable. It's really up to the regulatory framework and up to regulatory agencies. So Andrea, I don't know if you can.
Yeah, I think I have a very practical example in mind of an endpoint that is considered easy, aims mutagenicity, lot of data, a lot of good models. Probably many of these predictions and models are acceptable for many regulatory uses. However, when it comes to reach, for us it's essential that the fifth strain and metabolic activation are explicitly considered. And if they are not, it's a problem. So even for those simple endpoints, some regulatory purposes, as you just said, for some regulatory purposes, the same prediction may not be as valid as it will be in other contexts.
Great, thank you both. There is a question, I'm not sure, Andrea, if you can answer this. It's a little, it's not quite the topic of the webinar, but it's about performing read across with the OECD QSAR toolbox for polymers and UVCBs. Do you want to touch on that briefly?
Yes, I think I cannot say no to questions on toolbox anyway. But yes, so QSAR toolbox, we call it now a decision support system for an expert to perform a read across. So let's take the example of a UVCB. In a UVCB, you may have one or more representative structures, and you may be maybe one thing you can do with toolbox is to take one constituent of the UVCB at a time and look for specific analogs of that. Polymers, I don't think you can do anything with toolbox. But remember, if you use the QSAR toolbox and your purpose of use for the read across is the read across assessment framework, then you should also use the so for read acrosses under reach, you need to use the read across assessment framework, the RAF, and there are many things that need to be considered. And QSAR toolbox can be a starting point, but then there is a lot more work to be done for an acceptable read across.
Thank you. There's a question about resources for using read across and QSAR models for beginners. And I know that there are lots of resources out there. I will just say there are lots of scientific societies and NGOs that provide training and webinars like this one. Also, Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine has some, the PETA Science Consortium as well. And maybe I'll let Andrea talk a little bit about some of the QSAR trainings that are available and patients, and Olga, if you have anything to add.
Yes, so last year or 2 years ago, I don't remember anymore, we released at least 3 webinars as official ECHA webinars on QSARs and or QSAR toolbox. So if you just Google for ECHA webinars, you go to the main page and then you search for the keyword toolbox or QSARs. There are webinars. Some of them are reach specific, some of them are more generic. Good news that no one knows about it yet, but I can announce it now. Very soon we will release 16 tutorials for beginners on the QSAR toolbox. And this is something completely new. They will go to the ECHA YouTube channel. And the next year we want to produce as many tutorials. So because we realize many people want to learn about toolbox, some people are lucky enough to go to trainings from Olga or other people that do trainings on toolbox. But yes, we are also working on having more resources. And one thing that I was thinking, Christy, if next year you want to host a webinar on the QSAR toolbox, that we can also do.
Yeah, that would be great. Absolutely. Anything to add, Olga?
I think I fully agree with Andrea. It's a very good thing that some video recording of the previous webinar, they are still available. So also among the manuals of the toolbox, there are a lot of great material. I don't know if it's really for beginners, but they are quite, some of them, they're quite intuitive to use, so they're great. And I think that I don't have anything to add. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think we have maybe one last question that we'll address. It's about the domain of applicability of the methods. How much flexibility is there in using alternative statistical methods like conformational analysis as compared to usual methods such as distribution analysis or structural similarity scores? Who wants to take that?
It's a very technical question.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, it's very interesting, but yes, if there is some information, it's always up to a regulator whether to accept or not a model and its prediction. But yes, if there are some information missing in the model documentation, it's still possible to use other methodologies. I'm not a big expert in the methodologies mentioned in the question, sorry for that. But I think it's also possible to substitute some lack of information by a local predictivity or something like that in the prediction checklist. And I think, yes, the graph is flexible. Why not? Andrea, what do you think?
Yes, I mean, in the end, if I think about the dossier evaluation and the reach, because I mean, here we must be specific for a purpose when we answer every question, because then other people can do things differently. What we evaluate is whether we have enough ground to trust the prediction as much as we will trust an experimental data for the endpoint being predicted. Maybe the applicability domain methodology is defined, or the applicability domain is defined in a way that is a bit different than usual. That is not so important if the information in the QPRF allows us to be confident that the substance is really in the applicability domain. When we check the reliability based on overall performance of the model, based on local performance, based on being in interpolation space rather than extrapolation space. If we can be convinced of this, then the methodology used for the applicability domain determination will not matter as much.
Okay. Thank you, Andrea, and thank you, Olga. And we have reached the end of our questions. So I just want to thank all of you for joining. We had lots of attendees on the line learning about the QSAR assessment framework. Thank you to both Andrea and Olga for your presentations, and thank you to patients as well. And maybe just to mention, there will be another OECD QSAR assessment framework webinar in a little while. Andrea, what is the date of that one?
November 9.
November 9th. Yeah. So in case you didn't get your questions answered or you wanted to get some more information, you can join that as well. And finally, of course, the slides and the recording of the webinar will be posted, as I said, on the ASCCT website, which is ascctalks.org, and it's in the webinar archive page. So thank you all very much for joining, and hope you have a good rest of your week.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.